Indian Prime Minister Modi set to meet with Chinese President Xi and Russian President Putin this weekend. It's all happening in China. The U.S. has recently imposed a 50% tariff on longtime U.S. allies, now over that U.S. ally in particular, over the purchase of Russian oil. For a look at the U.S.-India relationship, I want to bring in former Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan. He is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And we've been talking all morning about the implications of this meeting and what you think it ultimately means to the relationship between the U.S. and India, and ultimately the relationship between India, China, and Russia.
Well, it says to some extent that India is confused. It thought it had a wonderful relationship with the United States. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi seem to get along. And then suddenly India gets slapped with both 25% tariffs on all its goods, which is above the Asian norm, plus an additional 25% for trading oil with Russia, which it thought it was doing with the agreement of the United States. So I think this is in some ways a reaction. India is not China's greatest friend. They've actually fought a border conflict during the pandemic. Modi going to Shanghai is basically saying, look, we're going to look for alternatives if you can't be reliable.
Well, that's my question. How much is this meeting a signal to President Trump and to the United States that we may actually go be friends with folks that you think of as our enemy?
Well, I don't think it's serious. It's more a signal. I don't think that in the longer run, India would prefer China to the United States. In survey after survey, you find that Indians really like the United States. But I think the Indian leadership is basically saying, make up your mind. Which way do you want to go? Because otherwise we can strengthen other alternatives.
Wolf?
Professor, I was going to ask the extent to which you think, though, that India long-term now will be a significant trading partner with Russia regardless, and the kind of increase in imports of fossil fuels will stick forever, short-term, long-term, regardless of tariffs?
I don't think India gains a lot by buying Russian oil. Actually, before the war, it was accounting for about 2% of Indian purchases. India would be happy to go back to that. The discount on Russian oil is really quite small at this point. It thought it was buying Russian oil because the U.S. wanted somebody to take Russian oil so that oil prices globally didn't take a huge hike because Russia was shut out of the oil market. And in fact, what was imposed on the world was not so much you can't buy Russian oil, but you can't really buy it above $60 a barrel. And for the most part, India has stuck to that. I think if the United States, through a backdoor channel asked, please stop buying Russian oil, India would be pretty happy to do that. If you make it front and center,
surely that is what's just happened with these tariffs, is it not? I mean,
if you impose tariffs and you say you shall do this, it's a direct, question of India's sovereignty. You're basically saying you do this or else. I'm differentiating between a request, please do it, and it's backdoor. India would do it. India is a democracy. If India tomorrow stops the purchase of Russian oil because the United States told it to do it, the government would have to answer questions in Parliament. How come you're under the sway of the United States? So this is one of those things where a little diplomacy would have gone a long way. I don't think that's what has happened.
Well, Professor Rajan, is the prospect of diplomacy effectively dead at this point in time? Or are there any back-channel conversations happening now after those 50% tariffs went into place that could potentially reverse those?
I hope not. I hope the back-channel discussions are still underway. And I think this is a problem, certainly if the question is Russian oil. And by the way, China's the biggest purchaser. It hasn't been tariffed. Turkey purchases. It hasn't been tariffed. Even Europe purchases Russian energy. It hasn't been tariffed. So if this can be dealt with, and it doesn't seem like the most important issue is stopping Russia from selling energy, but if this can be resolved in the through back channels, I'm sure the temperature can come down a lot. But right now, there's enormous angst in India amongst the Indian people. What happened? We thought the United States was our friend.
Professor, I have one final question. It relates now to the tariff issue, but it relates to actually the whatever tariff gets put on China and how you think these negotiations therefore play out. You know, I think India thought they were going to get a favored nation status kind of tariff rate, if you will, and they wanted to get a rate knowing that it would be lower than where China is. Now, China happens to be lower than them. And so in terms of just the timing of all of this, to the extent that the United States renegotiates with India at some point, do you think that they could renegotiate with India prior to reaching a deal with China? A deal with China seems like that's the linchpin, but it may be a lot farther off.
The deal with China is likely to be very complicated and involve a lot of issues, including intellectual property, etc. So that's going to take time to nail down. I think in the meantime, if India is tariffed at these levels, a lot of poor farmers, a lot of poor shrimp farmers, a lot of textile manufacturers are going to go out of business, and that has long-term lasting damage. I think a short-term deal with India would be beneficial. It would also signal that India is a possible China plus one destination, that is, manufacturers can use India as an alternative to China. If the long-term aim is to get away from strategic dependence on China, that would be the clever move for the United States. So I would say a quick deal with India, take off the 25% tariff. India agrees to slow down and, in fact, terminate purchases of Russian oil, if that's a key issue, and bring down the tariffs on Indian goods generally from 25% to something like the Asian norm, which is more like 18, 19%, maybe even 15%. Right. I think that would do wonders for the India-US relationship.